Bavaria, Germany, September 15, 1945. When the Allied forces established prisoner camps across the bombed landscape of southern Germany, they left behind not just defeated armies and cities reduced to rubble, but also thousands of displaced souls caught in war's aftermath. Japanese soldiers captured thousands of miles from home, German civilians trapped between occupying forces, Korean laborers abandoned by their captors, and foreign workers stranded by the sudden collapse of the Reich. Among them was Hiroshi Tanaka, who at 24 years old had learned that survival in this strange new world meant following orders without question, keeping his head down, and remaining as invisible as possible among the sea of uniformed prisoners. But when American jeeps rolled through the reinforced gates of Camp Dachau Extension Site 7 with something completely unexpected, wooden crates filled with baseball equipment that seemed to belong to another universe entirely, a new and bewildering question emerged. Was this genuine American kindness, breaking through the machinery of war, or just another sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to break their remaining spirit? Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen forgotten stories buried in the archives of history. The crisp autumn air of Bavaria carried an intoxicating mixture of burning oak leaves, diesel fuel from American military vehicles, and the faint metallic scent of barbed wire that had become the defining smell of their existence. Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan, a stocky Irish-American from South Boston, whose weathered hands told stories of factory work before the war, carefully unpacked wooden bats from a military supply crate that bore Red Cross markings. Each bat emerged like an artifact from a peaceful world. Smooth Louisville slugger ashwood that gleamed despite months of transport, the grain patterns speaking of American forests and baseball diamonds under summer skies that felt impossibly distant from this concrete and wire compound. Around him, nearly 200 Japanese prisoners pressed against the chain-link fence that separated their barracks area from the central compound, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes betraying intense curiosity. These men had been captured during the final desperate months of the Pacific War, some from Iwo Jima's blood-soaked beaches, others from the Philippines' jungle campaigns, a few from the Homeland Defense Forces that never got the chance to die for the Emperor. Their standard-issue grey uniforms hung loose on frames that had lost weight during months of uncertainty, and their faces bore the particular exhaustion of men who had expected to die in battle, but instead found themselves alive in an alien land. The Bavarian countryside stretched endlessly beyond the camp perimeter, a patchwork of rolling hills dotted with traditional farmhouses whose distinctive steep roofs and timber frames belonged to a fairy tale world. Many of these houses stood empty now, their chimneys cold and dark. Their owners either fled westward ahead of the Soviet advance or buried beneath the rubble of total war. The September landscape painted itself in shades of gold and amber, beautiful in a way that mocked the ugly reality of captivity and defeat. Hiroshi pressed his calloused fingers against the cold metal links of the fence, feeling the rough texture of steel that had been manufactured in some American factory and shipped across an ocean to contain him. Behind him, his fellow prisoners murmured in the regional dialects of Japan, Tokyo sophistication mixing with Osaka merchant practicality, Kyushu fishing village accents blending with the formal speech patterns of former military academy cadets. Some whispered that this was obviously a trap, that any prisoner who showed enthusiasm for American games would be marked for special interrogation, possibly shipped to different camps where harsher treatment awaited. Others suggested with bitter laughter that it was elaborate mockery, forcing the sons of samurai to play children's games as a form of cultural humiliation designed to break their spirit more completely than any physical torture could achieve. Sergeant O'Sullivan noticed their hesitation and called out in carefully practiced but heavily accented Japanese, "Yakyū suki desu ka? Besuboru wo shimasu ka?" Do you like baseball? Will you play baseball? The words hung in the cold September air like morning mist over the alpine foothills, carrying implications that none of them fully understood. His pronunciation was terrible, the flat vowels of Boston fighting against the musical tones of Japanese, but the effort itself was unprecedented. When had an American guard ever tried to speak their language for any purpose other than barking orders? Hiroshi's heart began racing, not from the familiar fear that had become his constant companion, but from a memory so distant and precious it felt like archaeological treasure excavated from another lifetime entirely. Before Pearl Harbor changed everything, before the war consumed his world like a massive typhoon, before everything he had known and loved turned to ash and defeat, he had played baseball on the dusty diamonds of Nagoya, spending golden afternoons with his father, teaching him the subtle mysteries of the game. Those summer days seemed to belong to a different universe now. A Japan where American magazines were sold openly, where Babe Ruth's legendary 1934 visit was still discussed with reverence in barbershops and tea houses, where baseball represented friendship between nations rather than the bitter irony of enemies sharing a diamond behind barbed wire. His father, Kenji Tanaka, had been a devoted fan of the professional leagues, following the exploits of the Tokyo Giants with the passion other men reserved for poetry or politics. "Baseball is about respect, Hiroshi," his father had said on countless occasions, adjusting his young son's grip around the seams of a regulation ball, teaching him to feel the raised stitching that would determine how the sphere moved through air. Respect for your teammates who depend on you, respect for your opponents who challenge you to improve, and respect for the game itself, which teaches us that both victory and defeat are temporary conditions in a longer journey toward understanding. That same father had later sent his son to war with a blessing carved into a bamboo bat handle, praying to ancestral spirits that it would bring him safely home to play again on peaceful fields. Camp Commandant Colonel James Morrison emerged from the stark concrete administration building, his polished boots creating a rhythmic crunching sound on the gravel pathways that divided the compound into precise geometric sections. The prisoners immediately snapped to rigid attention, their bodies automatically assuming the posture of military discipline, even as their minds remained focused on the surreal scene unfolding before them. But Morrison's expression wasn't the stern administrative mask they had come to expect from their interactions with American authority. Instead, he carried a baseball glove, worn brown leather that spoke of countless games under different skies, the pocket shaped by years of catching fly balls and line drives, the laces darkened by honest sweat and the natural oils of human hands that had once played for pure joy rather than military necessity. "Gentlemen," Colonel Morrison announced in clear, measured English, then repeated the words slowly in carefully practiced Japanese that revealed months of study, "We are going to try something completely different here, something that has never been attempted in the history of military prisoner operations." His voice carried the authority of command, but also something else, a tentative hope that seemed almost dangerous in its vulnerability. The wind picked up across the Bavarian plateau, rustling the carefully maintained barbed wire and sending small dust devils dancing across the makeshift baseball field that the American Engineering Corps had cleared inside the main compound. The infield had been leveled with military precision, the base paths measured and marked according to regulation specifications, and a pitcher's mound constructed with the same attention to detail that built fortifications and landing strips. Hiroshi watched with growing amazement as guards began removing their steel helmets and setting down their M1 Garand rifles, taking positions around what was unmistakably meant to be a proper baseball diamond, complete with backstop constructed from surplus chain-link fencing. The scene felt like a fever dream induced by malnutrition and longing, armed American soldiers preparing to play a peaceful game with enemy prisoners in the heart of defeated Nazi Germany, surrounded by the bombed-out remnants of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. The juxtaposition was so absurd, so completely outside the established order of military occupation, that several prisoners began to wonder if they were experiencing some form of collective hallucination brought on by the stress of captivity and the psychological pressure of an uncertain future. The first baseball had arrived at Camp Dachau Extension Site 7 exactly 4 days earlier, nestled incongruously inside a Red Cross care package that also contained life-saving medical supplies, chocolate bars that tasted like childhood memories, and letters from home for the American Guards, missives that connected them to a distant country where their wives waited and their children grew older without them. Sergeant Michael Patrick O'Sullivan had discovered the baseball while methodically sorting through the donated materials in the supply depot, a converted German barracks building that still bore faded Nazi eagles on its concrete walls. Something about that worn horsehide sphere had triggered an idea so audacious it bordered on outright insubordination of military protocol. The ball bore the official American League stamp and showed evidence of extensive use, scuffed leather, slightly uneven stitching, the kind of honest wear that came from countless games played on sandlots and municipal fields across America. As O'Sullivan held it in his work-hardened hands, feeling the familiar weight and texture, he was transported back to his own childhood in South Boston, where Irish immigrants like his family had embraced baseball as proof of their American credentials. Hiroshi Tanaka's memory traveled even further back, to a sun-drenched afternoon in 1936, when his father had first taught him to properly grip a baseball in the shadow of historic Nagoya Castle. The ancient fortress, with its distinctive curved rooflines and white walls, had stood for centuries as a symbol of Japanese tradition, but on that particular day, it served as backdrop for a thoroughly American lesson in sport and character. "Baseball is about respect," Kenji Tanaka had said, his calloused carpenter's hands guiding his 7-year-old son's fingers around the raised seams of the ball. "Respect for your teammates who trust you with their success. Respect for your opponents who push you to excellence. Respect for the umpires who maintain fairness. And respect for the game itself, which teaches us that both triumph and defeat are temporary states in the longer journey of personal growth." That same beloved father had later blessed his son's departure for military service with a traditional ceremony, presenting him with a bamboo bat carved with protective symbols and prayers for safe return. Kenji Tanaka had died 6 months ago in an American bombing raid on the aircraft factory where he worked, manufacturing Zero fighters for the Emperor's final desperate gamble. Hiroshi had learned of his father's death through a letter that took 3 months to reach him through the chaos of Germany's collapse, and he still carried the grief like a physical weight in his chest. Now, surrounded by concrete barriers, guard towers, and the omnipresent barbed wire that defined their daily existence, Hiroshi wondered if his father's ancestral prayers had been answered in the strangest possible way. The American sergeant was demonstrating proper batting stance to a growing circle of curious prisoners, his movements precise and instructional, despite the obvious awkwardness created by language barriers and cultural misunderstanding. His Boston accent made English sound harsh and unfamiliar, but his body language spoke the universal vocabulary of athletics and patient teaching. Private Antonio Rodriguez, whose own father had immigrated to Texas from Guadalajara, with nothing but determination and a love for baseball, was attempting to explain the complex infield fly rule through an enthusiastic combination of Spanish phrases, broken English, and theatrical gestures that would have been comical under different circumstances. Rodriguez had been a semi-professional player before the war, good enough to dream of the major leagues, but not quite talented enough to escape the draft when America needed soldiers more than shortstops. The cultural exchange was creating moments of unexpected comedy that helped diffuse the tension inherent in any interaction between captors and captives. When Sergeant O'Sullivan tried to demonstrate the proper technique for executing a sacrifice bunt, his exaggerated movements and facial expressions led several Japanese prisoners to believe he was describing some form of martial arts combat technique. Similarly, when Hiroshi attempted to teach the Americans the traditional pre-game bowing ceremony that showed respect for opponents, several guards nearly toppled over trying to match the precise angles and timing that reflected centuries of Japanese social protocol. The other prisoners remained deeply divided about participation in what some viewed as collaboration with the enemy. Kenji Watanabe, a former naval officer from an old Tokyo family whose ancestors had served the emperor for generations, muttered darkly that accepting American hospitality was shameful, a betrayal of their military duty that persisted even in defeat and captivity. "We are not children to be entertained," he argued during evening discussions in the barracks. "This is psychological warfare designed to make us forget our obligations to the homeland and the spirits of our fallen comrades." But younger prisoners like 19-year-old Taro Yamamoto, who had been captured during the final chaotic weeks before surrender, watched the baseball preparations with barely contained excitement that reminded everyone of their own youth before war consumed their innocence. These younger men had grown up hearing legendary stories of Babe Ruth's triumphant 1934 tour of Japan, when the Sultan of Swat had been welcomed like royalty and baseball diplomacy had briefly promised to bridge the cultural gap between two nations that seemed destined for eventual collision. Colonel James Morrison observed the developing situation from his office window on the second floor of the administration building, watching through Venetian blinds as the first tentative exchanges began between his guards and the enemy prisoners. His own son, Lieutenant Robert Morrison, had been killed 8 months ago during the bloody assault on Guadalcanal, and every Japanese face in the compound served as a painful reminder of that irreplaceable loss. The official telegram had been cruelly brief. "Regret to inform you that your son died heroically in service to his country." No details, no context, just the bureaucratic language of mass death that reduced individual tragedy to statistical notation. Yet something about the universal language of sport felt like a possible path toward healing wounds that ran deeper than national boundaries or military casualties. Morrison had been a collegiate baseball player himself at West Point, good enough to captain the team, but not talented enough to dream of professional careers. He understood the peculiar magic of baseball, how the game could create temporary communities among strangers, how competition could foster respect rather than hatred, how shared rules could establish common ground even among enemies. His aide, Lieutenant Richard Thompson, knocked precisely and entered with the routine afternoon reports that documented every aspect of camp operations: prisoner counts, supply inventories, security assessments, medical reports, and the endless paperwork that transformed human beings into administrative categories. But Morrison waved the documents away with an impatient gesture. "Not now, Thompson. I have the distinct feeling that history is being written on a baseball diamond, and I want to watch it happen." The late afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the distant Bavarian hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded everyone of autumn evenings in whatever homeland they called their own. As shadows lengthened across the compound, the first genuinely informal baseball game began to take shape, with American guards and Japanese prisoners facing each other across an improvised pitcher's mound that had been constructed with engineering precision, but marked with the kind of hopeful improvisation that characterized all human attempts to create joy in the midst of institutional control. The tension of months, the careful distance maintained between captors and captives, the mutual suspicion born of recent warfare, the cultural misunderstandings that made every interaction potentially dangerous, began to dissolve into something approaching normalcy as both sides focused on the familiar rhythms of America's pastime. When Private Danny Jensen, a farm boy from Iowa whose gentle nature made him unsuited for the brutality of combat, threw the first experimental pitch, a gentle underhand lob that any child could have hit safely, and Hiroshi Tanaka stepped into the makeshift batter's box and swung with muscle memory that transcended years of war and displacement. The connection between bat and ball created a sound that seemed to echo across continents and cultures. The baseball soared high over the improvised outfield, carrying with it months of suppressed hope and the crazy possibility that former enemies might discover their shared humanity through the simple act of playing a game together. As the ball descended toward a patch of autumn grass beyond the barracks buildings, both American guards and Japanese prisoners erupted in spontaneous laughter and applause. The first genuine celebration that anyone in Camp Dachau Extension Site 7 had experienced since Germany's surrender 4 months earlier. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know what places and what moments of day or night these documented accounts of human resilience managed to reach across the globe. By the final week of September 1945, the baseball games had evolved into a daily ritual that transformed Camp Dachau Extension Site 7 into something unprecedented in the extensive history of military prisoner operations. Word of the Bavarian baseball experiment had spread through official military channels, reaching headquarters in Munich, where Allied generals and military psychiatrists engaged in heated debates about whether this unprecedented fraternization violated established protocols for prisoner management and potentially compromised the psychological advantages that traditional power dynamics were supposed to maintain. Some senior officers, particularly those with extensive combat experience in the Pacific Theater, called it a dangerous precedent that could undermine military discipline and encourage similar requests from other prison camps across the occupied territories. They argued that maintaining clear boundaries between victors and vanquished was essential for preventing future conflicts and ensuring that defeated enemies understood the consequences of aggressive war. Others, however, recognized the baseball program as potentially innovative rehabilitation that might provide insights into post-conflict reconstruction and the psychological processes necessary for transforming enemies into peaceful neighbors. Hiroshi Tanaka had emerged as the unofficial captain and primary organizer of the Japanese team, his pre-war baseball experience making him invaluable in teaching teammates who had never held a regulation bat or understood the subtle strategies that made baseball more than just hitting a ball with a stick. During the mandatory morning roll call, conducted with military precision in the central courtyard, he would quietly organize practice sessions using makeshift equipment that demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Smooth river rocks wrapped in strips of cloth torn from spare clothing served as practice baseballs, while wooden planks salvaged from construction projects became serviceable bats that allowed players to develop proper swing mechanics. The American guards initially observed these informal practice sessions with the professional suspicion that had been drilled into them during military police training, watching for any signs that sports equipment might be converted into weapons or that prisoner gatherings might facilitate escape planning. However, as days passed without incident, the guards gradually began offering technical suggestions and mechanical corrections that revealed their own deep knowledge of baseball fundamentals. Sergeant O'Sullivan, whose South Boston childhood had included countless hours of sandlot baseball, found himself unconsciously coaching Japanese prisoners on proper fielding techniques and base-running strategies. The language barrier created ongoing challenges that generated their own peculiar comedy of errors and cultural misunderstandings. When Sergeant O'Sullivan attempted to explain the concept of a sacrifice bunt, deliberately making an out in order to advance a teammate to scoring position, his animated demonstrations and exaggerated facial expressions led several Japanese players to believe he was describing some form of American martial arts technique that involved ritual self-defeat. The irony wasn't lost on men who had recently lived through a war where actual self-sacrifice had been elevated to the highest virtue. Similarly, when Hiroshi tried to teach American guards the traditional Japanese pre-game ceremony that involved precise bowing to show respect for opponents, equipment, and the field itself, several guards nearly lost their balance attempting to match the exact angles and timing that reflected centuries of social protocol. Private Rodriguez, whose Mexican-American heritage had taught him to appreciate formal courtesy, proved most successful at mastering these rituals, creating an unexpected cultural bridge between Japanese tradition and Latino respect for ceremony. Dr. Elizabeth Hartmann, a German physician who had been recruited by the Allied Medical Corps specifically to study the psychological effects of various prisoner rehabilitation programs, had been documenting the baseball experiment with scientific rigor that would later influence military psychology throughout the occupation zones. Her daily reports, typed on a portable typewriter that had survived the bombing of Berlin, noted remarkable changes in prisoner behavior that extended far beyond the baseball field itself. Subjects displayed decreased aggression indicators, improved cooperation with authority figures, and what I am tentatively classifying as therapeutic normalcy, a psychological state where individuals begin to function as human beings rather than merely as institutional categories. Dr. Hartmann wrote in her September 30th report, "The simple act of engaging in structured recreational activity appears to be reversing months of institutionally imposed dehumanization that affects both prisoner and guard populations. Most significantly, competitive play seems to provide acceptable channels for expressing aggression and dominance needs that might otherwise manifest in disciplinary problems or psychological breakdown." The baseball equipment had grown increasingly sophisticated as word of the program spread through informal military networks and civilian organizations back in the United States. Care packages from Major League Baseball teams began arriving weekly, containing professional quality gloves, regulation baseballs, aluminum bats, and even team jerseys donated by players who had heard about the program through newspaper articles that portrayed it as an example of American values triumphing over wartime hatred. The Japanese prisoners, displaying the same attention to detail and craftsmanship that had made their military equipment legendary for quality, had fashioned their own distinctive uniforms from available materials in the camp. Using needles made from wire and thread unraveled from blankets, they created matching shirts and caps that incorporated traditional Japanese design elements with baseball imagery. Rising sun motifs were carefully combined with baseball diamonds, creating symbols that honored their heritage while embracing their new competitive identity. Hiroshi wore uniform number 7, both his personal lucky number and, coincidentally, the numerical designation of their camp, embroidered in precise red stitching that would have met professional standards. Colonel Morrison had established formal operational guidelines that legitimized the program while maintaining military discipline and security protocols. Games could only occur during specifically designated recreation hours. All equipment must be signed out from and returned to guard custody after each use. Any display of aggression or unsportsmanlike conduct would result in immediate program suspension, and all participants must maintain standard military bearing during non-recreational periods. These boundaries, rather than limiting the effectiveness of the program, seem to enhance its psychological importance by creating a clear distinction between the baseball field and the rest of their institutional existence. Both American guards and Japanese prisoners began treating the baseball diamond as genuinely sacred ground, a temporary autonomous zone where the normal hierarchies of captor and captive could be temporarily suspended without threatening the overall security structure. The established rules created a framework within which former enemies could compete intensely while maintaining the mutual respect that made continued coexistence possible. The transformation wasn't universal or without complications. Some guards remained fundamentally uncomfortable with the informality and apparent role reversal that occurred during games, particularly when Japanese prisoners demonstrated superior athletic skills that reversed the usual power dynamic. Certain prisoners continued to view any participation as collaboration with occupying forces, a betrayal of their military honor that would shame their families and dishonor the memory of fallen comrades who had died rather than submit to enemy control. These philosophical and cultural tensions occasionally erupted during games themselves, heated arguments over disputed calls that seemed to carry the weight of larger historical grievances, moments when wartime hatred surfaced through seemingly innocent sporting competition, instances where competitive intensity triggered memories of recent combat that made it difficult to remember that former enemies were now temporary teammates in a larger human enterprise. But increasingly, as autumn deepened and the first hints of Bavarian winter began to appear in morning frost and shorter days, the baseball diamond became a space where such conflicts could be expressed and resolved through the structured competition of organized sport rather than the chaos and destruction of violence. The game provided rules, referees, and established procedures for handling disputes, institutional mechanisms that allowed for the expression of competitive intensity without permanent damage to relationships or persons. As October approached with its promise of organizational changes, rumors circulated constantly through the camp that their unique community would soon be dissolved, with prisoners transferred to different facilities based on their repatriation status, and the complex negotiations between Allied governments and Japanese authorities about the logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of displaced persons to their homeland. The temporary nature of their situation made each game feel more precious, each moment of shared humanity more significant against the backdrop of an uncertain future that might scatter them across continents without hope of reunion. The letters began arriving in substantial numbers during the final week of October, delayed responses to the controversial photographs that Colonel Morrison had courageously decided to allow during baseball games. Military photographers had documented the unprecedented scenes of American guards and Japanese prisoners sharing dugouts, celebrating home runs together, and engaging in post-game conversations that would have been unimaginable just months earlier when these same men were attempting to kill each other across Pacific battlefields. Families in both America and Japan struggled to comprehend the black and white images that accompanied letters describing their sons' strange new circumstances. Photographs that showed former enemies laughing together, sharing equipment, and displaying the kind of easy camaraderie that typically required years of friendship to develop. The mail brought both harsh criticism and curious support, forcing everyone involved in the program to articulate and defend what had begun as a simple, spontaneous gesture of shared humanity. Hiroshi Tanaka's mother, Sachiko, wrote from their family home in Nagoya, her careful brushstrokes conveying complex emotions that traditional Japanese epistolary conventions struggled to contain. To see you smiling in the photograph with American soldiers, I confess I do not know whether I should feel pride or shame. Your father always said that baseball transcends the boundaries of war and politics, but the neighbors whisper that you have forgotten your sacred duty to the emperor and the spirits of our ancestors. Perhaps they do not understand that survival itself is a form of duty, and that maintaining your humanity under these circumstances honors your father's memory more than any dramatic gesture of defiance could achieve. The letter included pressed flowers from their family garden, cherry blossoms carefully preserved between sheets of rice paper, autumn maple leaves that still retain traces of their brilliant red color, and a single white chrysanthemum that symbolized both mourning and hope according to traditional Japanese flower language. Sachiko had continued tending the garden alone after her husband's death in the American bombing raid, finding solace in the seasonal rhythms of planting, growth, and harvest that connected her to generations of Tanaka family tradition. Meanwhile, Sergeant O'Sullivan received a substantial care package from his hometown team in Brooklyn, containing items that seemed to arrive from another universe entirely: autographed baseballs signed by current players, team photographs that showed an integrated roster reflecting post-war changes in American society, and a personally written letter from Jackie Robinson himself, whose recent breaking of baseball's color barrier had made him a symbol of social progress and democratic ideals. "Baseball is America's greatest gift to the world," Robinson had written in his distinctive, careful penmanship, "because it teaches us that talent and character matter more than the circumstances of birth or the prejudices of society. What you are accomplishing in Bavaria proves that even in the darkest circumstances created by human hatred and international conflict, sport can light the way forward toward mutual understanding and shared respect. You are demonstrating American values more effectively than any government proclamation could achieve." The letter circulated among all the American guards, creating a sense among participants that they were engaged in something with genuine historical significance rather than merely passing time until repatriation orders arrived. Robinson's endorsement legitimized their experiment in the eyes of men who might otherwise have questioned whether fraternizing with recent enemies compromised their patriotic duty or dishonored the memory of fallen comrades. The baseball games themselves had evolved into sophisticated competitive enterprises characterized by detailed statistics meticulously kept by Private Rodriguez, who had discovered an unexpected talent for scorekeeping that rivaled professional standards. His handwritten ledgers documented individual and team performance with obsessive precision. Batting averages calculated to 3 decimal places, earned run averages that tracked pitcher effectiveness, fielding percentages that measured defensive reliability, and even advanced statistics like slugging percentage and on-base percentage that demonstrated genuine analytical sophistication. The Japanese team had formally adopted the name Bavarian Dragons, combining their current geographic location with a mythological creature that held significance in both Japanese and German cultural traditions. They had designed their own logo, a stylized dragon coiled around a baseball bat, with flames that suggested both destructive power and transformative energy. The American team called themselves the Liberation Nine, a name that referenced both their military role and the traditional 9-player composition of a baseball team, with uniforms that incorporated patriotic elements alongside standard baseball imagery. Their competitive rivalry had intensified with each game, but the competition remained remarkably clean and sportsmanlike. Disputes over close calls were settled through respectful discussion rather than confrontation, and both teams had developed informal protocols for handling disagreements that emphasized fairness and mutual respect over winning at any cost. The games had become genuinely exciting entertainment that drew spectators from throughout the camp, including administrative personnel and medical staff who found themselves emotionally invested in outcomes. Dr. Hartman's increasingly detailed medical reports documented remarkable physical improvements among all participants that extended far beyond what might be expected from recreational exercise alone. Japanese prisoners who had arrived at the camp suffering from malnutrition, depression, and the physical effects of prolonged stress now showed measurable increases in muscle mass, improved cardiovascular health, better coordination and reflexes, and what she termed social reintegration indicators, psychological markers suggesting successful adaptation to post-conflict civilian life. The American Guards, many of whom had been exhibiting symptoms of what would later be classified as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder, reported significant improvements in sleep quality, decreased anxiety levels, reduced aggressive tendencies, and improved relationships with family members in their correspondence home. Baseball, it appeared, was serving as effective therapy for psychological wounds that traditional military medicine had no established procedures for treating. The most unexpected and personally meaningful development involved the emergence of genuine friendships that transcended national boundaries and recent military history. Former enemies began teaching each other skills that had nothing to do with baseball, practical knowledge, and cultural insights that created personal connections based on mutual respect rather than institutional necessity. Hiroshi, whose pre-war education had included engineering and mechanical training, helped American maintenance personnel repair damaged equipment using techniques he had learned from Japanese manufacturing processes that emphasized precision, efficiency, and elegant problem-solving. His knowledge of metallurgy and stress analysis proved invaluable for maintaining baseball equipment under heavy use, and his ability to fabricate replacement parts from scrap materials impressed guards who had assumed that all Japanese technical knowledge was limited to military applications. In return, Sergeant O'Sullivan taught Hiroshi American slang, baseball strategy, and cultural references that would prove valuable if he ever had the opportunity to visit the United States during peacetime. Their conversations during equipment maintenance became informal English lessons that helped Hiroshi develop conversational fluency while giving O'Sullivan insights into Japanese culture that challenged his wartime stereotypes about enemy motivations and character. These personal exchanges created relationships that existed independently of the institutional framework that had brought them together. Friendships forged through shared competitive experiences that transcended the temporary circumstances of military occupation. Men who had recently been attempting to kill each other discovered common interests, similar values, and complementary skills that suggested the possibility of genuine international cooperation in a peaceful world. The October weather grew progressively colder as autumn advanced toward winter, forcing games to be moved indoors when possible or onto increasingly muddy and uncomfortable outdoor fields when the desperate desire to play overcame considerations of comfort and convenience. The determination to continue baseball despite deteriorating conditions impressed military observers from other prison camps, who began requesting permission to establish similar programs for their own prisoner populations. Military psychiatrists and social scientists arrived from headquarters in Frankfurt and Paris to study what they had begun calling the Bavarian baseball experiment, documenting techniques and procedures that might be successfully applied to other post-conflict situations throughout the American and British occupation zones. Their preliminary reports suggested that structured recreational competition might be more effective than traditional rehabilitation methods for preparing former enemies to become peaceful neighbors in the post-war international order. As the first snow began falling on the Bavarian hills and winter approached with its promise of administrative changes, everyone involved understood that their remarkable community was necessarily temporary. Repatriation orders would eventually separate these unlikely teammates, sending them back to countries that were still processing the psychological and cultural trauma of total war. But in the meantime, they had created something genuinely extraordinary, a space where former enemies could discover their shared humanity through the simple but profound act of playing America's national pastime together behind the barbed wire of a military prison camp. December 15, 1945. Heavy snow had begun falling before dawn that morning, covering the makeshift baseball diamond in a pristine white blanket that seemed to erase the visible boundaries between fair territory and the sprawling prison compound beyond, creating a temporary landscape where the ugly realities of barbed wire and guard towers were softened by the democratic beauty of natural winter weather that recognized no distinctions between captors and captives, Americans and Japanese, winners and losers in the great global conflict that had finally ended. The long-awaited repatriation orders had arrived exactly 3 days earlier via secure military telegraph from Allied headquarters in Frankfurt, transmitted through channels that connected Bavaria to Washington, D.C., where bureaucrats were managing the massive logistical challenge of returning millions of displaced persons to their home countries. The Japanese prisoners of Camp Dachau Extension Site 7 would be transferred to Hamburg for administrative processing and eventual return to a Japan that had been transformed by defeat, occupation, and the beginning of democratic reconstruction under American guidance. Today would mark the final baseball game between the Bavarian Dragons and the Liberation Nine, the end of an experiment in human understanding that had lasted exactly 4 months and had created friendships that would endure far longer than the institutional circumstances that had made them possible. Hiroshi Tanaka stood at home plate in the gently falling snow, holding a Louisville Slugger bat that had become as familiar to him as his own hands during months of daily games and practice sessions. The wooden barrel, darkened by use and marked with the small dents and scratches that testified to countless successful hits, felt perfectly balanced in his grip as snowflakes dissolved on its smooth surface. Around him, teammates who had become brothers through shared competition prepared for their final innings together, each man understanding that this game would end not just their season, but their community. The American Guards had organized an elaborate pre-game ceremony that reflected months of cultural learning and mutual respect. Each Japanese player was presented with a regulation baseball signed by every American participant, leather spheres that bore careful inscriptions in English expressing friendship, respect, and hopes for peaceful reunions in some imagined future when international travel might again be possible for former enemies. These baseballs, wrapped carefully in cloth and packed in individual wooden boxes constructed by the camp carpenter shop, represented keepsakes that would carry memories of Bavarian winter back to the rebuilt cities and villages of post-war Japan. Colonel Morrison delivered a formal speech that was translated sentence by sentence by bilingual personnel who had been trained specifically for this ceremony, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air as he spoke words that he had rehearsed for weeks. "Gentlemen of both teams," he began, his voice carrying across the snow-covered field to spectators, who included not only camp personnel, but also visiting officials who had come specifically to witness the conclusion of what historians were already calling an unprecedented experiment in post-conflict rehabilitation. What we have accomplished here during these past 4 months proves conclusively that even in war's immediate aftermath, when hatred and suspicion should logically prevail, human decency and mutual respect can still flourish under the right circumstances. You have demonstrated that competition can unite rather than divide, that shared rules can create common ground even among former enemies, that respect transcends nationality and ideology, and that sport can heal psychological wounds that seemed permanent and irreconcilable. The Japanese prisoners responded with a deep, synchronized bow that lasted exactly 15 seconds, not the mandatory bows of defeated soldiers acknowledging superior authority, but the voluntary gesture of accomplished athletes honoring worthy opponents and expressing gratitude for opportunities that had exceeded their wildest expectations when they first arrived at this camp as broken, demoralized prisoners of war. The game itself was played with an intensity born of finality and mutual respect, where every pitch carried additional significance because everyone understood there would never be another opportunity for these particular competitors to face each other across a baseline. The cold weather made every movement more difficult. Baseballs became harder to grip securely, bat swings lost some of their fluid power, and fielding ground balls required extra care on the slippery surface, but these challenges only increased the drama and meaning of each successful play. Hiroshi, now wearing the captain's armband that had been voted to him by unanimous team consent, had spent the previous evening in the barracks teaching his designated replacement, 19-year-old Taro Yamamoto, the subtle psychological arts of reading American pitchers that he had mastered through months of careful observation and analysis. "Watch their eyes and shoulders, not their hands or feet," he had instructed, passing along knowledge that represented the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of at-bats against players whose individual tendencies he had learned to recognize and anticipate. Americans telegraph their intentions through their facial expressions and body language more than they realize, but you must train yourself to see these signals while maintaining your focus on the mechanics of hitting. Sergeant O'Sullivan, pitching for what everyone knew would be the final time to these particular batters, found himself unconsciously memorizing each face in the opposing lineup. Men whose batting stances, swing patterns, and competitive personalities had become as familiar to him as his own teammates from childhood sandlot games in South Boston. Private Rodriguez had prepared elaborate statistical summaries for the final game, creating individual scorecards as keepsakes that documented not just today's performance, but season-long achievements that would allow participants to remember their athletic accomplishments long after the immediate circumstances had been forgotten. Even the American guards who had initially opposed the baseball program now stood along the baselines in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something historically unique that deserved to be remembered and honored, regardless of their personal feelings about fraternization policies or military protocol. The photographs being taken by official military photographers would eventually reach archives in Washington and Tokyo, but the emotional significance of the moment belonged to the participants themselves. The score remained tied at 4-4 through 9 regulation innings, forcing extra play that no one wanted to end because the conclusion of the game would trigger the administrative machinery that would separate this community forever. Both teams played with technical excellence, sharpened by months of practice, but also with obvious reluctance to achieve the victory that would end their time together. Spectacular defensive plays were matched by clutch hitting, and strategic decisions reflected both competitive intensity and mutual respect for opponents who had earned admiration through months of shared effort. When Hiroshi finally connected solidly with a fastball in the bottom of the 11th inning, the crack of bat-meeting ball echoed clearly across the snowy field despite the muffling effect of winter weather. The baseball rose high into the gray December sky, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of men who had discovered that enemies could become friends through the simple process of learning to play together rather than fight against each other. As the ball sailed over the improvised left field fence and disappeared into a snowbank beyond the compound walls, both teams erupted in celebration that transcended the normal boundaries between winners and losers. Hiroshi rounded the bases for the final time in his life, his footsteps leaving clear tracks in the snow that would be filled and erased by continuing precipitation within hours. But the memory of this moment would remain vivid for decades. American guards and Japanese prisoners stood together along the baselines, applauding not for victory or defeat, but for the conclusion of an extraordinary chapter in their shared human experience that had transformed enemies into friends through the ancient magic of competitive sport. The post-game ceremonies were subdued, but deeply meaningful, as individual players from both teams sought each other out for personal farewells that attempted to compress months of friendship into brief conversations. Addresses were carefully exchanged, despite uncertainty about whether international mail service would ever make correspondence possible. Promises were made to attempt contact through Red Cross channels if political conditions permitted, and hopes were expressed for a future world where such friendships might flourish without the artificial framework of military occupation. Hiroshi shook hands with each American guard individually, gripping firmly with the mutual respect that had been earned through months of competition and camaraderie rather than imposed by military regulation or diplomatic necessity. These handshakes represented personal connections that transcended national boundaries and recent history, bonds forged in the crucible of shared athletic achievement that would endure regardless of political developments or geographic separation. Dosa Hartmann completed her final comprehensive report that evening, working by lamplight in her temporary office to document what she called the transformative power of structured recreational competition in post-conflict psychological rehabilitation. Her findings would later influence prisoner treatment protocols throughout the American and British occupation zones, though no subsequent program would achieve quite the same remarkable combination of athletic excellence and human understanding that had characterized the baseball experiment in Bavaria. Her conclusions were both scientifically rigorous and personally moving. Structured competitive sport, when properly administered under appropriate security protocols, provides measurable therapeutic benefits that exceed conventional rehabilitation methods. Participants demonstrate improved physical health, enhanced psychological stability, increased social cooperation, and what can only be described as restored faith in human decency. Most significantly, former enemies who engage in regular athletic competition develop genuine mutual respect that may prove more valuable for long-term international peace than formal diplomatic agreements. The buses arrived precisely at dawn on December 16th, their diesel engines rumbling impatiently in the cold morning air as drivers prepared for the long journey north to Hamburg and the final administrative processing that would return these men to families and communities they had not seen for years. As the Japanese prisoners boarded for transport, carrying their few personal possessions and their signed baseballs in carefully protected packages, Hiroshi looked back one final time at the empty baseball diamond that was already being reclaimed by falling snow. The field would be used for other purposes after their departure: vehicle parking, equipment storage, perhaps eventually converted back to its original function as an administrative area. But the memory of what had happened there would endure in the personal stories of men who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to family and friends how baseball had taught them that enemies could become brothers through the simple process of learning to compete with honor and respect, rather than hatred and vengeance. Behind him, Sergeant O'Sullivan stood at attention with his fellow guards, watching the buses disappear into the snowy Bavarian countryside. The baseball equipment had been carefully packed away, but the lessons learned during 4 months of unprecedented cooperation would influence how these men approached conflict and competition for the rest of their lives. They had discovered that sport could build bridges across the deepest cultural and political divisions, creating understanding that survived long after the games themselves had ended. If this story has captured your attention and moved you to consider how sport can unite people across even the most bitter historical divisions, please leave a like. It helps ensure that Hiroshi's remarkable story reaches more people who need to understand that even in humanity's darkest moments, bridges of friendship and respect can be built through the simplest acts of shared competition and mutual recognition of our common humanity. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments about how athletic competition can create lasting peace between former enemies. These carefully documented stories of human resilience and international friendship deserve to be remembered, shared, and applied to current conflicts that might benefit from the same spirit of respectful competition that transformed a German prison camp into a laboratory for post-war reconciliation.